So this video is a follow-up to my City Tiles video, where I show how to make insanely detailed modular city backdrops for your D&D games that work with all my other modular systems to make some truly epic scenes. In the next few minutes I'll be showing you how to make some magnetic, removable LED street lamps that are easy to store and keep that battery hiding base as tiny as possible. Welcome to the archive. My name's Matt. I started off trying these pre-wired LED street lamps from Green Stuff World, but even after removing the resistor, they still weren't strong enough to use with this build. The light they gave off was too little to even light up the tile that it stood on, so it was a little bit of a non-starter. Luckily, I was planning on doing a homemade version anyway for anybody who didn't have the ability to buy these. What is also nice is that this design is more medieval in theme. I started with some 3/16 of an inch balsa square dowel, which I cut into 3 pieces for the pole, the arm and the bracing accordingly. I used balsa, but you could easily use foam instead. The main pole I drilled end to end with a 2mm drill bit, but first I drilled a 1mm guide hole to make sure that it would run straight down the middle. It's important to make sure that you pull out all of the drill waste and check you can poke a wire through before continuing, or you're gonna kick yourself later. The arm I cut at the end, basically halfway across where I would be gluing it to the pole, and kept the offcut as neat as possible. If the offcut breaks for some reason, don't panic, you can literally just cut another short piece of that rough length and glue it on. This can sometimes even be better because you can glue on a slightly longer piece and trim it down once it is glued in place. I gently drilled the larger piece of the arm on one side, 1/4 of an inch from the end to halfway through, and widened it on each side to fit the prongs of a 5mm LED in comfortably. With that open, I drilled straight down the length of the arm end to meet it, before cutting in a space on the arm end to fit some wire through at the bottom. The bracing I just cut at a 45-degree angle on the ends, trimming it to make sure it would line up before gluing it in place, but that's later. To get the light, I made a lantern out of a 5mm flickering yellow LED by cutting some squares of 1mm styrene and polycementing 2 pieces of them together like this, drilling 2 1mm holes in the top piece wide enough apart to fit the prongs of the LED through, and then supergluing it in place. Again, I used styrene, you could use thick card or even cereal card. Optionally here, you can use a knife and sandpaper to sand down the bottom of the LED to get it to fit more snugly to the lid. This halves the amount of light that gets blocked by the bottom of the LED and basically makes the lantern a bit brighter. Incidentally, a makeup brush is a great way to get gunk out of your sandpaper. Also optionally, you can add texture to the styrene using the polycement stippling method that I show in the Soul Columns video, though this is mostly overkill, even for me. With that made, I used some overhead projector sheets, which are basically just thin plastic packaging that you can buy in nice, neat, large sheets, to make the frame of the lamp. To do this, I cut a 5/16 of an inch strip, and then measured and cut a nick on both sides at a 1/4 inch intervals, leaving about 1/8 of an inch hanging over the end to glue. From there, I just glued it to the bottom styrene piece and superglued a strip of parchment paper over it, cutting off the excess, before gluing the bottom of the lantern on. The good news here is it's really easy to pull this bit off again and have another go if you don't get it quite right. Then I started playing with the LED. I cut the prongs down to 3/16 of an inch long to fit inside the arm with a little bit poking out, and used some cheap 0.5mm thick wire to connect it. I cut them each down to 4.5 inches long and stripped the ends about 1/2 inch from each end, and then bent each one tightly around one end of the LED, holding the tip in place against the opposite prong while I wound them up. I also bent the tip around afterwards to avoid crossing wires.
Don't cross the streams.
Then to secure it, I used some of this wire glue to make sure the connection was protected, and then superglued over that glue once dry to make it tougher. From here, I threaded the wire through the arm and superglued it in place, and then threaded the wire down through the main pole, supergluing the arm in place and the end cap back in to cover it, covering the join with some cereal card, which I tacky glued on. To hide the batteries and make them removable, I used these little battery mounts, which you can buy for cheap online. Links are in the equipment list below. These mounts use 1225 coin cell batteries, which are the smallest 3-volt batteries that I could find, which really helps them fit inside tiny terrain like this. The one change I did make to these little mounts was cutting little gaps in around the connectors to wrap the wire around them just that little bit more. I hid these inside 2 layers of 1/8 of an inch thick XPS cut down to 3/4 of an inch squares. I pressed the mount into the bottom one and cut a space for it with an X-Acto knife, and then pushed the top piece of foam down on top, indenting it further with the back of a brush, and then indented the post into the top of that piece too, cutting a space for it using the X-Acto knife. I threaded the post through the top, cutting little wire gaps in the bottom of the post, and tested which end of the wire needed to connect to which end of the battery holder, before supergluing the post itself to the battery holder to match, using the top piece of foam to line up the placement so the foam pieces both line up and the post is straight-ish. With it glued in place, you just need to strip the wire on each side as far as you need to and wind it around each little connector tightly, before cutting off any excess and using wire glue and superglue again to seal. Then I just brought the top piece of foam down and hot glued it in place, adding bricks and texture similar to the pattern that I used on my stair blocks. Finally, I glued the bracing arm on with superglue, stained the balsa using homemade black wash, and added some bolts to the bracing using styrene cut from thin rods. But you could do this by dabbing with Mod Podge like I've shown in earlier videos. The metallics I painted in Vallejo metal colour steel, after giving the corners of the lamps a thin line of Mod Podge and black paint to show the metal casing. This is a bit sharp, so to grim it up a little bit I added a wash in the recesses of AK streaking grime, using a bit of sponge once it was dry to make the effect more ragged and natural looking. And voila! Bright streetlights that you can use for some seriously atmospheric, creepy night encounters. In darkness, the light even spreads about 6 inches, so it even works for a rough show of where lighting is in-game. Well, bright light, at least. And if you want the lights to be consistently brighter, you can use non-flickering LEDs. They flicker by getting dimmer a lot. And if you want it even brighter, you can choose to not add the parchment paper casing and sand down their LED resin instead. But I'm happy with this compromise for now. Please subscribe, like, comment and share. And until next time, I'll be in the archive.